When one thinks about the Arctic, you think about the major powers that are up in that part of the world. You think about the United States, you think about Canada, you think about Norway, you think about Russia. But of course, Europe has potentially significant interest in that part of the world for access to resource issues and for the matters of shipping coming over the pole from major European ports to and from major European ports to ports in the Far East. So if and when there was a sufficient level of access into and across the Arctic region, then the increase in traffic that one would see from a maritime point of view in that region would have a fundamental impact upon European maritime security interests in the area. One needs to bear in mind that nations like France and the United Kingdom are the major naval powers in Northern Europe and therefore are responsible for delivering security in the North Atlantic. And if there was an increase in shipping using the Arctic, either transversing the Arctic or coming out of the Arctic, then those waters would be busier, and there would be an incumbent responsibility on the likes of the United Kingdom and the French to take responsibility for security in this part of the world. And then when you add in the fact that in due course you could have Denmark, Greenland seceding from Denmark, and Iceland also becoming EU members, which you already do, of course, have Sweden, then you may have a situation where the European Union would have direct territorial interest in the region. So there are lots and lots of reasons why the Arctic is of interest to European nations. And then when you add in the fact that nations like China, Japan, South Korea are all interested in the Arctic for resource reasons, for shipping reasons, this creates a situation where you have a large focus on the Arctic situation, not just for environmental reasons, but for maritime security reasons as too, because with that large number of powers having interest in the region, while one would hope that the idea of promoting responsibility about environmental issues would mean that any issue that may arise would be dealt in a cooperative manner, there is the risk that any potential conflict over resources or territory, simply because of who is interested in the region, could escalate. And that is one of the reasons why the Arctic security matter could have a significant impact upon European maritime security interests. When you talk about the agenda, if you like, for European maritime security interests, the southern part of European waters, the Arctic, the Indian Ocean tend to get priority, and the northern European waters in and around the United Kingdom and northern France and northern Europe and in and around the Baltic and the Scandinavian countries tend to get overlooked quite a lot, which is quite significant, particularly in the context of the current situation with Russian actions in the Ukraine and elsewhere. And that creates a lot of nervousness, particularly in the Scandinavian countries, about security issues involving Russia and the like. But when you look at the way in which European nations are looking to address those potential risks in northern European waters, there's actually a lot being done between navies to cooperate. The recent Northern Coast exercise held in Finland tried to develop within the navies an ability to be able to respond more quickly to real-world events as when they happen. No specific reference was made to the current Russian crisis, but of course the timing is very interesting. And navies generally are working an awful lot more on cooperating together. For example, you have a task force now established between Sweden and Finland. You've had Danish vessels interoperating in a Norwegian task group recently. So lots of the navies in the region are doing more to integrate together into this part of the world. The issue of European interests in and around the Mediterranean from a maritime security point of view is perhaps one of the most fundamental questions that Europe faces when considering its maritime security approach going forward. The Mediterranean has come back onto the world stage in security sense in a big way in the last few years. Not only do you have the current situation with instability all around the region, from southern Europe economic instability to the political instability in North Africa to the problems in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, you also have a number of issues at sea taking place in the region currently. For example, major oil and gas resource finds, migration issues coming across from North Africa into southern Europe, concerns about counter-terrorism, traffic, as in Operation Active Endeavour, NATO's only Article 5 operation currently. So there's a whole mix of issues that are taking place in and around the Mediterranean from a maritime point of view. When you add into that the Russian Navy seeing access to the Mediterranean from the Black Sea as critical as enabling it not only to have a presence in the Mediterranean to secure its interests there, but also then project power into the Indian Ocean through the Suez Canal and the Red Sea, the Russian Navy has a more prominent presence in the region, and it even has been saying that it wants to develop that presence on a permanent basis. And then you have to add in, of course, the China factor. In 2010, a Chinese state-owned shipping company bought a pier in the Greek port of Piraeus. So a Chinese state-owned shipping company has deep water pier access in a NATO member, and that wasn't something that raised much attention, if you like, or raised much discussion, beg your pardon, in the press when perhaps it should have done. And in 2013, a Chinese naval task group called into Portugal on the Atlantic coast. So the Chinese are now not only using their base in the Indian Ocean to project power into the Mediterranean, but also now doing that through the Mediterranean and into the Atlantic itself. So you have all these factors that come together in the Mediterranean from a security point of view, from the presence of major powers point of view. And then when you raise the question of, is the US able to continue to commit resources to the region from a naval point of view? Yes, it has some destroyers in Spain. Yes, it has still a physical presence in terms of ships, but perhaps not to the same extent that it used to do. So does this create a situation that when you add in all the issues of nation-state responsibilities to do with looking after oil and gas resources in the region, does this create a situation where there needs to be a more coherent European focus on providing security in the Mediterranean region? And if so, how does it do that? What assets does it have available to do that? When we think about how Europe is projecting power overseas beyond its immediate waters of interest, the primary example that springs to mind is the Indian Ocean and the European naval contribution to the counter-piracy activity under Operation Atalanta, the EU NAVFOR operation, which is set up and started running in December 2008. The interesting thing about that particular operation was that it was the EU took the lead in addressing the global counter-piracy problem that was affecting that was impacting upon the security of shipping transiting through the Somali Basin at that time. They took the lead ahead of the NATO organisation that was to come under Ocean Shield, and they took the lead ahead of the US-led Combined Maritime Force task group that was to come together in due course too. So on behalf of the European nations, the EU NAVFOR, Operation Atalanta, made a very, very strong and quick statement of intent of using naval power to secure the interests of member states. And that helped to corral and prompt the actions of NATO and the CMF forces to follow suit. And now you have a very well established and so far quite effective trilateral operation that has, to this point, managed to reduce the amount of the incidence of Somali piracy in those waters, in partnership, of course, with operations ashore that have helped to dissuade the pirates from doing what they were doing. The question remains as to what extent the EU will continue to do this. There is a mandate in place to continue to do this for another couple of years, but when there are resource pressures, it raises the question of to what extent, if a problem isn't happening, member states will see a need to divert their resources elsewhere. For example, if there are problems off the west coast of Africa or problems in the Mediterranean or in Northern Europe that require ships, then if the navies of Western European nations haven't got that many ships, is there going to be a pull on the time of those ships to another part of the world? When talking about European maritime security, there's generally tended to be a focus on surveillance assets, looking at satellite capabilities, looking at other kinds of surveillance capabilities that will provide European nations with coverage of those key waters, the key waters that are of interest to it, both home waters and further afield. But when thinking about maritime security, it's important to remember that actually when you see something that you need to deal with on the surface of the sea, you then need to have something on the surface of the sea to go and deal with that situation. And the European navies have sometimes struggled to demonstrate that they have sufficient ability to be and capacity to be able to deploy surface forces to go and deal with a particular situation. However, when you look at the numbers of ships, surface ships in particular, that European navies have together, they have a significant number. And perhaps a more collective use of this capability may help to spread the burden more evenly. When one talks about a capability as bespoke as the submarine, European navies have been having a bit of a difficult time. A submarine, by definition, is out of sight and out of mind, and therefore not much is ever discussed about why a submarine does what it does and why that is important. So consequently, and also because of the cost of producing a submarine, often which is produced by a national industrial base because the nature of what they do means you can't necessarily do this collaboratively as well as you might like to. It often means that there's a question, questions are raised from a political point of view, from a strategic point of view, and from an affordability point of view as to whether certain nations should be continuing with the submarine program. So many navies find challenges in justifying this, but then when you look at what a submarine adds in terms of security benefits to a nation, it's very significant. The problem is that many navies and their parent nations just can't discuss that. But moving beyond that, when one talks about surveillance issues, whether that's in the Indian Ocean looking for pirates, whether that's in the Mediterranean and looking for illegal migration coming across, when one talks about Arctic security and maritime safety at sea in that part of the world, the surveillance capability provided by maritime patrol aircraft is a really, really important thing for European navies to continue to develop. And there's been, of course, much discussion over the years of whether the UK should re-engage in this capability after its decision to stand down its systems in 2010 in the Defence Review. But it's important to note that what Europe does, in certain cases, it does very, very well. For example, take mine countermeasures. A number of European nations, the UK, the French, the Belgians, the Dutch, have a very, very capable mine countermeasures force that is much in demand around the world, for example, in places like the Gulf or off the coast of Libya. And more importantly, that capability is very much valued by key actors around the world, like the United States and its Navy. And having that capability gives the European nations, both individually and as a whole, a degree of political impact that they otherwise might not have.